to what extent are artists people that see into the future in some regard? 1915, right? Sometimes I just look through, these Russian poems, and I try to sort of like structure them mentally, or right before the Russian Revolution. Here in so many ways, it captures World War I experience of Russia. It captures post-revolution. It captures her life. This is, in some respects, going to be how her life ends. Hi everyone. Today I want to just sort of go over a few poems by Marina Tsvetaeva. She's probably my favorite poet in Russian. So we're going to start with maybe my favorite poem of hers. I've seen very nice translations of it that, they keep the rhymes and they keep the meaning. Perhaps she has a better poems, but in Russian especially, right, with the kind of repetitions of the sounds, and unlike English, Russian is definitely able to do things like this final little thing, right? Drug drugu. It means to each other, right? Drug means friend. I'm sure most of you guys know that word from like Clockwork Orange and stuff like that. Drugu, of course, like Russian is inflected, so the nouns themselves, they take all kinds of different forms, but also you're able to reduce the number of actual words that you're using. Something like this, right? You could have tons of different kinds of repetitions like this that really stick in the mind. So I'm going to read it in Russian, and then I'm going to read it in English. And of course, when I do my English translations, I'm never really aiming for like great translation, in the sense that, if you look at Mitchell's translations of Rilke, right? Those are great translations, right? It's kind of like, I'm sure the German is probably even better, because it seems like to me the English is good enough, right? It seems like we're getting a lot. When I do translations, like I said before, I like to give a literal sense of what's going on. Even with some of the word order, I did have to like do word order in a way that's kind of like more natural English a little bit, but just to give you a sense of like, when a Russian is reading this and when a Russian is hearing this, what exactly is going through the head, right? Because even with something like word order, obviously within German, you could tell something like this, right? That's going to have a pretty stark effect on how the brain processes things. So this is one of her more famous poems. I believe it appears somewhere on what is it, Leiden in the Netherlands, or it could be somewhere else, right? There's actually, I don't know what is in Leiden exactly in the Netherlands, where they have like a bunch of they have like walls with poetry on them. There's actually a lot of Russian poetry there, right? Maybe there was like some community there at some point, I'm not sure, but I believe this is one of the kind of like famous poems that appears in that city. So let's read it. Я знаю правду, все прежние правды прочь. Не надо людям с людьми на земле бороться. Смотрите вечер, смотрите, уж скоро ночь. О чем поэты, любовники, полководцы? Уж ветер стелится, уже земля в росе, уж скоро звездная в небе застынет вьюга, и под землею скоро уснем мы все, кто на земле не давали уснуть друг другу. So the English, I know the truth, all former truths away. There is no need for people with people on earth to battle. Look, evening, look, it will soon be night. What about, or what are you about, or what are you talking about? What is this all about? Poets, lovers, generals. The wind spreads, already the earth is in dew, soon the starry blizzard in the sky will freeze, and under the earth soon we will all fall asleep, who on the earth didn't allow sleep to each other. All right, first line, я знаю правду, все прежние правды прочь. We have obviously the repetition of sound. Pravdy, we have proch. Some of it, right, sounds a little bit sonorous. Other words are fairly harsh. Like proch to me has always been, not only because like proch is like kind of like it's often used as a kind of in the way that she's using it here, command. Proch also being an adverb. There's this kind of like harsh quality to it. There's the kind of sonorous quality to it. There's this idea of former truths, right? I saw some translations of this as kind of like I forget the word that they used, but it's much better to sort of think of a word like prejny as former, things that maybe used to be true, or not true anymore. Or, I mean, you could read this line in a completely different way, right? You could sort of view it as now, with this kind of like adjudication of this new truth, or kind of like the totalizing truth. Не надо людям с людьми на земле бороться. Sometimes, like when people translated this, they try to get rid of like people by having the second translation a little bit different, right? I mean, you could always find like a synonym for people or whatever, but I like to keep it because, I mean, look, right? This is what is being processed in the Russian mind, right? Людям с людьми. And of course, these are not like nominative nouns, right? Не надо людям, right? There is no need for people, right? So you take люди, which is a nominative form, and you turn into людям. Essentially, you take a word that wouldn't normally have that M, right? You have an M here, you have that second M here, but also just a tiny little variation of this E, right? Не надо людям с людьми на земле бороться. E, right, versus the yeah, close enough where, this is something that you'd sort of keep in your mind a little bit, right, as it's being read, right? This kind of, it's similar enough where you see patterning. It's different enough where things never really become quite monotonous. Земля, right? Well, земля here, right, is because it's na земля, right, on earth. The nominative would be земля, right? We're going to have repetition of that as well. So again, like any translations that sort of miss the repetition, right? There's definitely something being lost, right? You definitely should not try to kind of like omit the repetition. Смотрите, right? This is a command. Look, вечер, смотрите, уж скоро ночь. Now, this word уж, there's a few different meanings. One common one is the word уже, right? It means already. Sometimes уже is you just chop off that second syllable, right? That second that third letter, and you just turn it into uj, right? And it's this kind of like there's like an informal, casual quality there. Another definition for uj is it's kind of hard to explain in English because, like, although in English we do have intensifiers such as very or whatever, the kind of like a word like uj, it's so short and it can be used in so many different contexts. It's almost like almost like a particle type of intensifier. Like, part of the way that you could translate this, of course, like already, right? It's soon going to be night, but as an intensifier, it would almost be like, well look, or like, don't you see? It's kind of like when I was translating the Ada Yukasheva, was it? No, it wasn't talking about Moscow. It was Вечер бродит, right? Evening wanders. And the second line is Вроде ты любишь вечера, right? And I didn't like, it's only like a few words in Russian, but in English, it would be so long, it would fill up the entire sort of screen, and I didn't want to do that, so I sort of like dumbed it down, simplified it a little bit, right? Вроде ты любишь вечера would mean something like, didn't you once say, or didn't you once give me the impression that you enjoy or you love evenings, right? That's a little too much to put into a line, so I just sort of simplified it. And here it would be this kind of like, don't you sort of see that it's already going to be night here? Kind of like in a positive, right? It's almost kind of like a but, right? But, soon night is going to come, right? And there's so many different ways that you could play with this, and there's so many different ways that you could potentially translate it. And I did it kind of like perhaps, maybe one of the worst ways that you can. It will soon be night in parentheses, and it's like people wouldn't even understand what that means, but I'm explaining it to you guys. Then you have this next line, о чем поэты, любовники, полководцы. This о чем, what are you on about? You could also say, what is this thing about? What do you represent? What do you mean? There's no, like, oftentimes, like, I'm not sure if it's in this book where I sometimes like buy these. They have like cheap copies of this either on Kindle, or you could get it like physically, Andre Neller, where it's just like there's side-by-side translations. There's like poems here that I haven't seen before, and it's nice having like a side-by-side where I don't have to like necessarily always have a dictionary with me, and I don't have to like look various things up, and also just like I want to see what people are thinking as they're writing. Yeah, so he translates о чем as why do we fight, right? Oh, poets, lovers, and commanders. That could be the mentality. That could be one of the meanings. But I guess the reason why I don't really favor those kind of translations is it really, like, I don't like to lock in a poem, especially if it's like from a another language, into just specifically one kind of meaning. I think the multiplicity of meaning is good. So obviously one of the ways you can interpret this is, what are you guys fighting about? What do we fight about? But it could also mean, what do you represent? What do you mean, right? A chom could also be specifically each individual here, right, that's named poets, lovers, generals. They have different functions. They have different things that they do. I'm going to just kind of generically, right, just literal, again, if I were to try to make this into like a great translation, right, I wouldn't necessarily take this route or just leave it as what about, but as an explanation for you to know what's going on, right? The service that I'm providing you here, you could always find good translations of Russian, right? But you're not going to find people that are really able to sort of explain what's going on in the background and why it's going on and what makes it interesting, right? So this next line is also interesting. Уж ветер стелится, уже земля в росе, right? So this стелится, it could mean spreads. It could also mean to sort of creep along slowly. It could also mean to rush along quickly, right? So it's interesting how these things happen. But Russian actually does have a bunch of words where, and I can't think of any off the top of my head in English, but I'm sure they exist in English too, where you have something that's kind of like, it means one thing, but it could also mean literally the exact opposite too, and it's fine. And also, stelitsa, as a kind of like idiomatically, it also refers to like, making one's bed. If you remember when I did that translation of like the big Russian playlist that I put together, like the hour-long one, there's a song, the first song actually by Yuri Vizber, right? And the first actual song in the playlist, he has this like wonderful little inversion later on where he's comparing this, this love of his, which I think it was actually written about Ada Yakasheva. And he's saying something like, he's comparing the lover to this star that is burning, through a blizzard, and also quite needlessly, right? Just burning for the sake of burning near the end of the poem, rather near the end of the song. And one of the descriptions that he makes of this kind of like burning star is it allows you to see and do certain things, right? And he says, чтобы стелить постель, in order to make one's bed, right? In order to make the bed, right? Very interesting image. So here we have a wind, right? It's a wind that is spreading. It's a wind that is creeping. It is a wind that is kind of, almost making its home, right? If you want to sort of go a little bit with this стелить постель sort of image, or also, rushing along, right? Again, the majority of translations that I've seen, they do sort of lock you into one way of viewing it, but I'm just giving you that perspective. Уже земля в росе, right? The earth is in dew, right? And also notice this kind of like uj and уже, right? While uj could very well be a уже just like without the extra letter, right? Without the extra syllable. For the people that are kind of watching this, that do want to be writers or are kind of poets or whatever, right? One thing that I often do in my poetry, and one thing I appreciate about even like a little poem like this, is I generally, like, if I'm writing something and I'm like, fuck, I already use that word, right? I already use this kind of image. Like, I need to do something else. Like, I like to have that variation. If I want that repetition, just kind of like aesthetically, it's not necessarily something that would make a poem better or worse, but aesthetically, since I want always that sort of a variation, but still I understand the repetition itself is very powerful too, right? Depending on the context, right? You could use it very well. I mean, she's using it here again and again, right? So we have an example right here. But, this is like an interesting way of doing that. We're taking a word that could very well mean the same thing, but also have these other little layers that allows you to not just be monotonous in the writing. Уж скоро звездное в небе застынет вьюга. So I had to give a more kind of like English word order because this is the actual literal уж, let's just say already. Уж скоро, already, soon, звездное, right, as an adjective, звезда, right, means star. Звездный means starry, masculine. Звездная, right, feminine, right? We need to capture the Vyuga, right? Vyuga meaning, it could mean blizzard. That's, I think, maybe the most common one. Already, soon, feminine, starry, in the sky, will freeze the blizzard or the storm. Oftentimes in the translations, right, what you get locked into is this kind of idea of, there's an actual blizzard going on. And the reason why it's starry is you see, the stars burning through the blizzard or whatever. But I've often, viewed this as the stars themselves being the storm, right? The storm, I mean, you see stars as blue, right? You see stars as sort of tinkling. You sort of see the kind of winter imagery, to use again the example of Yuri Visper, right? Right, he has that wonderful song that I translated, Zimnya Pyesnya, right? Winter song. И нанизно рождение луны на хрустальное копье тишины, right? And strong is the birth of the moon on the crystal spear of silence. So even without pure winter imagery, right, you have, anything that's crystalline is going to look like a blizzard. It's going to look like a winter. So it could be, and that's the thing, it could be both. We're talking about the possibility of you see stars through the blizzard, but the other part of it is even, beyond our lives, right? Even this thing, this cosmos, that thing could still, it could freeze. Yes, you could say freeze, right? But Zastinit also means kind of like in the, like if a cop says freeze or whatever, right? That, to quiet down, to stop moving, to, to like reduce that activity. I've never really purely in this kind of like more and more of that like pure winter imagery, this kind of like mess that you see in the sky, right? With these stars, they too will still. И под землёю скоро уснем мы все, кто на земле не давали уснуть друг другу. И под and under the earth soon will fall asleep, we all who on the earth didn't allow sleep to each other. Кто на земле, right? So we have the under here, that's pod. In Russian, the on is not. You obviously don't get the same sort of kind of like more direct, immediate feel of pud and na, right? Just one syllable. We're creating the contrast in the meaning. We have the similarity in the, in the syllabic counts. This variation too, right? Землёю, земля. For somebody like me that always wants to have variation, sometimes even to the point of detriment, right? I sometimes have to go back and be like, all right, now I need to sort of redo this here, make this more similar in some ways, or like go back to reusing this word. Look what you could do in Russian, right? Земля, землёю, земля. Just like, again, going back to Adi Yakasheva, right? If you look at my translation, my discussion on the website, in the Stony River, kamin, right? It appears nominative, kamin, only once, right? And everything else, kind of like variation upon variation, on the same noun. It's just very immediately striking, right? Especially the fact that, it comes at the very end, right? This inversion. This is unexpected, right? Comes at the very end. To what extent are artists people that see into the future in some regard? 1915, right? Sometimes I just look through, these Russian poems and I try to sort of like structure them mentally, or right before the Russian Revolution. Here in so many ways it captures one experience of Russia. It captures a post-revolution. It captures her life, right? This is, in some respects going to be how her life ends.